everyone. The first talk by Allan is going to be entitled, What is an SBoM and why is an SBoM? Allan Friedman, or should I say Dr. Allan Friedman, is Senior Advisor and Strategist at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. He coordinates the global cross-sector community efforts around software bill of materials and related vulnerability initiatives, and works to advance their adoption inside the US government. Allan was previously the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives at NTIA, leading pioneering work on vulnerability disclosure, SBoM, and security topics. Prior to joining the federal government, Allan spent over a decade as a noted information security and technology policy scholar at Harvard's Computer Science Department and the Brookings Institution and George Washington's University's Engineering School, He's co-author of the popular text Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know. He has a degree in computer science from Swarthmore College and a PhD in public policy from Harvard University. He's quite friendly for a failed professor turned technocrat, in his own words. He's known as the guy who won't shut up about SBoM. He's known internally here at IoTSF as Dr. SBoM, but I think in general you can refer to him as the person who forced SBoM onto the global IoT security agenda. So if you've just joined us, we've had one or two technical issues at the start of this webinar, but I think we're now ready to begin. So I will stop waffling and hand you over to Allan Friedman. Allan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Hopefully folks can see some slides. Good afternoon to those of you across the Atlantic. Good morning if you're on my side. I'm very excited about the launch of this report today and a chance to really unpack what greater transparency can mean in the IoT and IIoT domain. So in case there are a few of you who aren't quite certain, what I thought I'd do today is give a very quick overview of what it is, and then we'll also talk about why we're doing this. Why is this something that is seen more and more as a priority? So first, just want to acknowledge that there are vulnerabilities out there, right? All software is written by humans or is written by AI chats that are built on human information. And so there are going to be risks. And it's more than just, vulnerabilities. And of course, we've all heard of vulnerabilities targeting or in IoT systems, but there are direct supply chain attacks. And here's just a random slide from a corner of the US government that shows that what's going on. And the third issue we can say is, in addition to vulnerabilities and attacks, there are also just certain things that we're collectively realizing we don't want on our networks, we don't want in our systems. And the challenge is, how do we know if we have those? Now, first, I also want to point out that this increased focus on what's in the supply chain is actually a good sign. It means that attackers are finding it harder and harder to do a frontal attack on our systems. Nothing's perfect in cybersecurity, but we're actually making some progress. And so one of the things that people who are trying to engage in harm, whether they're nation states trying to compromise our critical infrastructure, or just people trying to mine some Bitcoin on my computer, this is a good sign that we're seeing this trend. The core of SBoM is the idea that it doesn't really make sense for us to use what we don't know about. I think very few of us would say, oh yeah, these unmarked cans that someone just handed me, they're fine. And the model for it is transparency. So I keep a pack of Twinkies on my desk, and that Twinkie has a list of ingredients. And for me, it's still kind of strange that we expect more transparency out of a non-biodegradable snack than what we expect for these systems that run our homes, run our healthcare, run our national security systems, run our critical infrastructure. And so that's the vision about this. Now, let's pull on that metaphor of a list of ingredients for a moment, because the list of ingredients by itself won't keep your family from eating something where they have a very serious allergy to. It won't, magically keep me on my February diet to stay in nice shape. Won't by itself support, or it won't by itself make me follow a religious lifestyle or a plant-free lifestyle or anything like that. But good luck doing any of those things without that list of ingredients. And transparency is something we've seen across industry, and it makes markets work better. And we see the chemical industry, and indeed, like a lot of modern software security, we've pulled this from the industry world. And I also want to be clear what it's not, right? SBoM does not stand for, a silver bullet. It won't solve all of our problems, but it is going to be a critical data layer that allows us to better understand our risk. And the last thing I want to say, sort of in the motivation here, is if you're a nice, boring organization and you use like 12 pieces of business software, enterprise software that everyone else uses, maybe this isn't something that's critical for you. But for those of us that are in the device world, where our organizations depend on a whole bunch of brilliantly constructed things that all connect with each other, give us data, create these feedback loops, often the risks aren't going to be things that we'll be told about, right? Smaller manufacturers may not have their own CVEs. By the way, if you would like to become a CVE numbering authority, please talk to me. We have a whole program to help your organization move in that direction. But devices means that the attackers, the bad guys, are often looking not for your device, but they're going to be looking for something that's in there. So, I've lost there. Sorry about that. So, Allan, you've been talking about SBoM for a while. What the heck's an SBoM? An SBoM is just a dependency tree. Modern software is made up of other pieces of software, which is made up of other pieces of software, and so on. And an SBoM, in our cute little example here of Acme Appliance, has a couple of dependencies, and those in turn have dependencies. All we're asking for in an SBoM is to say, track those so that everyone is understanding what we have. And you don't even need that much data, right? If Acme Appliance is using Bingo Buffer, well, who makes Bingo Buffer? What's the version? So we can find out if Bingo Buffer 2.1 is up to date. What are some of the identifiers so we can look it up in databases? And then where did this data come from? Did it come from the manufacturer? Did it come from an open source upstream supplier? Something like that. And of course, it has to be machine readable. Why? Because anything we're doing in security in 2023 needs to be automation friendly. We have two data formats today, SPDX, which comes out of the Linux Foundation, CycloneDX, which comes out of OWASP. They're both great projects. They're both widely used by software suppliers, by IoT manufacturers, and by a lot of the tool makers that are providing SBoM services today. They're open source. They are competing standards, but today they are interoperable. And that's something that we're committed to doing here. This is making sure that they stay interoperable. Why is this helpful? It's helpful across the entire software ecosystem. If you make software, if you make devices, it's very difficult to claim that you are actually doing so in a secure way if you can't even tell me what you have in your product. So it's everyone who makes software should be thinking about this. So let's choose software, whether you're selecting an open source project or whether you're buying something. And again, you need to know what's in that supply chain. Are there known vulnerabilities? And by the way, if I'm about to buy something, what does it mean that the person I want to buy it from can't even tell me that they have this? And then lastly, when something's sitting on my network, when a device is on my network, when we discover a new vulnerability, there will always be new vulnerabilities. We need to quickly and easily understand whether or not we're affected. So again, if none of that appeals about why you should do this, guess what? A lot of us are going to have to. So this is a quote from the head of product security for one of the largest software manufacturers on the planet. And he says, we'll do it when someone makes us. Well, guess what? People are starting that direction. Executive Order 14028, which is coming up on its 2-year anniversary, has basically said US government is going to require SBoMs for things that we buy. And again, another hint, we buy a lot of things. So the vision here is to sort of think about that. Now, I can't say too much about how this is actually implemented today. This is something that is being finalized, and there are strict rules about what we can say. But what is an SBoM? Again, the thing that you're going to be required to have is a set of data fields, support for automation, and then a set of processes and practices, such as if you update your software, you need to update your SBoM. But it's more than that. The FDA, which regulates medical devices, has said every new medical device that goes on the market in the United States must have an SBoM. This model has been copied by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So if you think that this is just a some yank issue, it's not. This is going to be a global effort. And of course, our friends in Brussels have introduced the Cyber Resilience Act. And one of the things that requires is everything that's sold in the EU will have to have an SBoM. And again, that will take a little while for it to manifest, but this is coming. And it's also important to know that we can SBoM today. There are ongoing proof of concepts in the medical device community, the automotive community, and the energy community, and probably coming soon to a sector near you. This used to be a hard issue. There are now countless vendors that are out there providing SBoM services to generate and starting to manage them. The other thing I want to point out, and this is just a very quick detail, is that not all vulnerabilities that you're going to find in your supply chain are actually risky. And so we've introduced this idea called VEX, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. I don't want to get into it now, but this is something that will help us better prioritize what the risks in our supply chain are. So where's SBoM today? Tooling is still emerging, especially for consumption. I will acknowledge that we don't have a way of sharing this kind of data, and we're still focusing on the interoperability side of things. But there's no reason that organizations cannot use SBoM today and shouldn't start asking for it and expecting to be delivered. It should be on everyone's roadmap. What's coming next? More and better tools. It's fantastic to see so many startups out there, and there is venture capital looking for folks that are providing solutions. You're going to see more public sector requirements from governments, but also private sector requirements. We're starting to see SBoM built into industry standards. And at CISA, we're helping to advance and refine this. If you'd like to know more and help advance this, please reach out to us. But again, if this is intriguing to you and you want the starting point, check out the white paper that we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you very much, Allan. So we'll be coming back to Allan towards the end of today's webinar for the Q&A section. I'm about to introduce our second speaker now, and this section is going to be called Introducing the New IoTSF White Paper. Amyas Phillips is an independent IoT consultant and security scientist at Ambotech Limited. Amyas chairs the IoTSF's Supply Chain Integrity Project Group, whose aim is to help the IoT industry secure its supply chains so that users of connected devices can safely trust their equipment. Previously, he has led research and development projects at Secure Things, and before that, ARM, where his team's work can now be found in TLS 1.3 and the Pelion Device Management Service. His first job was after graduating, was employee number 2, in quotations, doing a bit of everything at alertme.com, which is now Centrica's Hive Smart Homes product. He subscribes to the view that nothing is more practical than a good theory. Amyas, please introduce yourself, introducing the new IoTSF white paper. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that great introduction. And thanks, Allan, for that really interesting talk and plug for the paper too. I really liked your analogy about Twinkies. That was a good one. so right on to the new IoTSF white paper. Software bills of materials for IoT and OT devices. I'm going to introduce this as the chair and editor of the supply chain integrity working group we've had that's produced this paper. But keep in mind this is the contribution of many IoTSF members who include regulators, operators, security specialists, and really the entire IoT community. Okay, so why this paper now? Last year we published a paper called Securing the Internet of Things Supply Chain, which we opened by saying that when you decide to let an asset into your system, you're deciding to trust large parts of its supply chain as well, and you won't even know which parts because the supply chain is opaque to you. And in that document, we really tried to focus on the unique parts of IoT supply chains, which is really mostly about the provisioning of devices into trust relationships. But we also tried to take a lot of the more general advice out there about supply chain risks and bring it down to IoT supply chains specifically. And right about the time we started work on that, then EO 14028, Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity, came out, which, as Allan said, was focused on reducing the United States federal government's exposure to software supply chain risks, with really aggressive deadlines as well, I might say. And CISA, NIST, and the NTIA have all done a ton of really great work on creating standards and best practices around software supply chains, for which SBoMs are kind of the figurehead, which is why that question about whether they're a silver bullet comes up, I think. Clearly, software is a huge component of any IoT or OT device. So it seemed like now would be a good time to repeat that exercise by looking at the new work that's been done and again, bringing it down specifically to IoT and OT devices. And actually in the process, one thing I discovered is, Allan already said, that the point of a good SBoM is to magnify the effect of other cybersecurity policies that you have. And one of which, really importantly, is vulnerability disclosure, which it just happened. The IoTSF published a paper in 2021. So that makes a nice set, which you can put together to make a complete supply chain and risk management collection. Anyway, what's in it? It's actually really simple. Part one explains the problems, which Alan's already gone over. So that is supply chain sources of risk, which I characterize as imported vulnerabilities, the prevalence and dispatch of which is kind of an aspect of quality of software, which it's really hard to measure. Actual supply chain attacks, which I think of as the deliberate insertion of vulnerabilities rather than accidental. Vulnerabilities that can be exploited in deployed systems. And yes, in many cases, you can't tell whether a vulnerability is deliberate or accidental. But on the other hand, there's also plenty of clear-cut cases of supply chain attacks. And the third one is open source software license compliance, which isn't usually considered in the cybersecurity domain, but it does introduce a source of risk, at least in the eyes of legal departments, of litigation and consequent disruption of operations. So it's worth including that, because also, as it happens, they have kind of pioneered the SBoM concept, as far as I know, as a way of helping big projects keep on top of multifarious open source software components and licenses. Part two digs into the SBoMs themselves, how you're going to generate them as a software vendor, a device OEM, or as an IoT/OT operator, what resources and tools what you might have available. Recently should include SBoMs received from suppliers, and how you're going to share the SBoMs, including the standards that Allan mentioned. And then the final part looks at how you can actually use SBoM, which is really the crucial thing to get the benefit. What you're actually going to do once you've got some transparency on those sources of risk to manage and reduce them. So specifically, it looks around what you can do to implement an OSS license compliance program, what you can do to hold suppliers to some standards of quality and information security practices, and what you can do to reduce the window of exposure to imported vulnerabilities. I thought it might be interesting just to call out some things that surprised us preparing it. I mean, it's subjective, but perhaps it would be useful. So one is really the wide availability of tooling. That surprised me because in fact there's tons of every single environment you can think of has tooling available, and there's really the amount of effort needed to implement such programming has gone down a lot. So this little tool Gripe I put up, it'll accept any standard, either of the two standard SBoM formats and search the National Vulnerability Database for you. The second thing that surprised me is really how difficult it is to keep on top of imported vulnerabilities. Anecdotally, 90% of imported vulnerabilities are not exploitable. But there's actually a kind of a bigger problem before that, which is that most organizations have a long way to go just to get to situational awareness where they have to deal with that high false positive rate. And then they've got a long way further to go to be able to promptly assess the exploitability and severity of those imported vulnerabilities and act on them. But one thing I would say is that everyone should be using a public vulnerability database. We just had an invitation from Allan to sign up, and everyone should, because they are one of the main things that make it easier to get on top of this tidal wave. The third thing I've noticed, is that a lot of the discussion around supply chain security kind of comes from a corporate governmental viewpoint, and maybe I'm just missing something. I feel like there is a bit of a lack of the OSS perspective, and that's not to say that open source software projects shouldn't be held to similar standards, but maybe just more that maybe we need to talk about more. The community needs to explore more about how they're going to be able to show that, because obviously open source software has a somewhat different paradigm. My feeling is that working through those issues will take a bit more time. And lastly, there's this perception, I came across this quite a few times in our discussions, that SBoMs are a security hazard, and they are, honestly, I mean, in a way, because they document code. But the fact is that not having one is a much bigger security hazard for anyone. And it's worth keeping in mind that what's really security sensitive isn't the SBoM, but the information about the vulnerabilities in those components, and most particularly which ones are exploitable. Okay, so what are the next steps we're recommending for IoT and OT software maintainers, device OEMs and operators? First, get the paper. It's in combination with the previous one. It gives everyone the tools to start putting in place the comprehensive supply chain cyber risk management program. Second, you should start building and sharing this one. There's no excuse for anyone not to be doing it now. Ask your suppliers for one, and on your own part, watch out for the unknown unknowns. It's difficult for all projects to spot all the different kinds of components they're bringing in. Typically, so yeah, it's worth taking time to carefully list out all the different pieces of the imported software components that you're getting, because otherwise you can easily miss something and no one will ever know. And the third thing is, once you've done that, you can start managing your supply chain risks. So a comprehensive program is to look at suppliers and your own secure development practices, the information security in place to protect the software assets. What the capabilities are around vulnerability management, which includes the reporting, disclosure, monitoring and remediation of those vulnerabilities, all of which need to be done quickly up and down the supply chain to close the window of exposure that people downstream have to vulnerabilities. Maintenance commitments, the future availability of the maintainers, importantly, and for IoT and OT OEMs and operators particularly, there's also this piece around device provisioning and update management operations, which are a specialist set of procedures in IoT and OT supply chains, which you really need to look at in addition to the software part of the supply chain. And in fact, it's a bit more, it involves a wider variety of, it's not as homogeneous as say software development. So it really pays to approach that part of it by looking at the supply chain as a designed artifact, and that has to meet, you can engineer to manage risk. Of course, that's true to an extent to software supply chains as well. All right, that's all I've got to say about it. Thank you very much. Get the paper now at the IoT Security Foundation, and there's a link there. And if you want to get involved in updating it or subsequent supply chain security guideline development, get in touch with me at amyas@ambotech.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amyas. Amyas, you're doing my job for me. I was about to say you can get that very paper at IoTSecurityFoundation.org. It is hot property. It was only published this morning. So go ahead to that very web address and you will find the white paper there. So moving swiftly on now to the next section of today's webinar. This one is, this section is going to be entitled "The Role SBoMs Play to Help Manage Risk in IoT Use Cases." Rob Dobson is Vice President of Technology Partners at Device Authority and has over 30 years of experience across cybersecurity, IoT, industrial OT and ICS, SaaS, semiconductors, and software engineering. He's worked on many complex IoT projects in the areas of transport and automotive, also industrial and smart factory, and healthcare, IoMT. Rob engages key partners across the IoT and cybersecurity ecosystems where he architects, markets, and brings compelling joint solutions to the market. He's been involved with several successful startups and is also a keen event speaker who has spoken at many events on the topics of IoT and cybersecurity. He was one of the speakers at this past October's IoTSF annual conference in London, and we're absolutely delighted to have him back. Everybody, please welcome along to today's webinar, Rob Dobson. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, guys. Hopefully you can hear me, and we've resolved all the technical problems. And it's nice to be here today, and I'm just following up from Allan and Amyas's great presentations. Hopefully you can see my screen. I'm Rob Dobson. I head up on Technology Partners, as Chris was just mentioning there. And we're part of the IoT Security Foundation, have been one of the founding members actually ever since it formed. And Device Authority are all about automating zero trust for IoT, and SBoMs are a really important subject in that space of IoT, and hence why we've got involved with doing the SBoM piece. So I want to talk to you about the role SBoMs play in this, and to talk you through a few slides on that. So without further ado, I just want to touch on some of the reasons for an SBoM, and Allan clearly sort of talked about some of the key drivers there, and I've pulled a few statistics out here myself just to talk about some of that. And actually this is from a report that Unit 42 did, I think it was like 18 months or so ago, looking at the split to different threats from an IoT standpoint. And clearly 41% on here is around, you know, exploits, SQL injection, buffer overflows, code execution, and so forth. Then you got 33% around botnets, ransomware, backdoor Trojans. We all know the user practice problems, for example, around password, default admin username passwords, never a good idea. Hopefully that's getting better these days, but we'll see. But the interesting thing with this report is that, you know, it's recognized that these devices we talk about as IoT are typically used as easy targets, and they're used as a stepping stone for lateral movements inside the network. So get on an IoT device, use one of the exploits somehow, and use it as a lateral movement to get after other systems in the network. So interesting numbers there. If you then compound that with what's happening around the vulnerabilities, in fact, I've pulled this data from cvdetails.com. And last year they published, I think it was 25,227, as you see in this graph here, across the years. That's 485 vulnerabilities found per week, which in my it's mind-blowing how many vulnerabilities that you know, have been driven here. And even this year you got 4,126 on just up to this date, right, which is a big number, and that's going to continue to grow. You then got things like the ENISA threat landscape for supply chain attacks, talking about, you know, 66% of the attacks focus on the supplier's code, 58% focus around gaining access to data, exploiting their suppliers, attacking on malware and so forth, 62%. But if you dig into the details, you can see here, fourth on the list is exploiting software vulnerabilities. And that's clearly with this SBoMs space, right, is why the SBoM is really important to help mitigate some of that risk. And as Allan mentioned, in comes the 14028 and the Cyber Resilience Act. And I've just pulled out a couple of points from the Cyber Resilience Act, which is in proposal phase. And it's talking to what manufacturers have to do to comply with this new proposal. And the top one in there is drawing up a software bill of materials in a commonly used machine readable format. Second one in there is remediate vulnerabilities without delay. So back to what Amyas was saying, is like trying to reduce the attack window as quickly as possible. Having a public disclosed information about what vulnerabilities that they fix. And you can read the list here, and having at the end here, we've got disseminate security practices without delay. So being able to provide those updates in a speedy manner, again, to reduce that attack window. And then in the white paper, we wrote, it's just been published today. There's quite a few really interesting statistics in there, and I've just pulled a couple out here about some 4 basic steps that you can do to try and reduce your exposure to those vulnerabilities. And the reason I put that in there is because you look at this, there's a number of reports that were published last year and Verizon 2019 that call out that 1 in 3 of information security breaches are from unpatched vulnerabilities in certain devices. And actually, when you look at the IT guys and how long it takes them for actually to fix those vulnerabilities, it ranges from 60 to 200 days. And that's a massive window, right? So 60 days, 2 months, or best part of just over half a year. That's it's a big number, and that's even compounded when you think about the challenge for IoT devices because of the sheer scale there, right? And you have to have automation there to be able to fix and manage the updates and so forth. But in the document, we talk about 4 basic steps. So 1 is clearly build an SBoM for your project. 2, search public vulnerability databases. 3, filter and triage those vulnerabilities. And 4, patch your devices, deploy updates and fixes. So yeah, definitely really encourage you to go and read the white paper. So SBoMs help to manage the risk in your IoT, OT, real estate. And, we touched on some of the things that they help with. So for example, providing visibility through the supply chain, what components have software in the supply chain, and managing that. You also have vulnerability management and monitoring, which you can apply to those SBoMs, right? So once you understand what software components you have, you can then use tools to be able to manage the vulnerabilities against those software bill of materials. Respond quickly to vulnerabilities. If new vulnerabilities are found, you can quickly get a view then of what high-risk vulnerabilities I have across my real estate of devices. And I think that's a really important point. It's the visibility aspect, which is very powerful. Provide threat intelligence, dependency tracking across products. Imagine you've got an organization's got, I don't know, 50 products and they're all carrying software. How do you know what's on what? And how do you track those software components? Remediation management and automation. I think this one's an interesting one, IP license management analysis. And in fact, actually, what's driving a lot of SBoM adoption today is not the CTO and CISOs, it's actually the legal counsel. Because what I want to understand is what licenses, what software licenses they're using. Is there any infringements? And try and mitigate it from a legal risk standpoint. So that was an interesting thing that came out in the report. And EUL awareness for out-of-date old software components. Clearly, if your products that you've shipped out the door got software that are out of date or going end of life, you want to maybe start thinking about a program to update those software components. But SBoMs aren't static, right? They're not static in nature because yes, you need to build them, right? Using the tools, store them, share where needed. You also then can check compliance, be able to determine IP license infringements and do the analysis around that. check against audits and stuff like that. But also, then you can manage these SBoMs, right? So you can provide the vulnerability management, manage 0 days, EOL awareness, and so forth. And clearly, remediation is a big part of this. So being able to manage credentials, update software, perhaps even if there's a low risk vulnerability is not used on the product, you just accept it's in that product, but actually there's no real risk for that. But as I mentioned, it's not static. So clearly all these products are going to be updated through the lifetime of their devices. So every time it's updated, you need to make sure the software bill of materials is updated and the loop goes around again. So this is management of those SBoMs. And Allan touched on, just moving on to this, so VEX. He touched on this VEX thing a little bit earlier, and I think actually adding context to SBoMs, which what VEX in my view does, helps to turbocharge their usefulness. And VEX is what we call as vulnerability exploitability exchange advisories and data. And what these guys are doing, what this is all about, is being able to provide machine readable vulnerability exchange documents and be able to then allow you to apply those to something like an SBoM database or your SBoMs to quickly get visibility about this new vulnerability that's available, which is now on any of your devices. Then you can make action about whether you want to remediate, update the devices, and so forth. But I think it's really powerful to give that, usefulness from the SBoM standpoint. So I guess just to talk about some of the SBoMs from an IoT OT standpoint, SBoMs are a really important part of that IoT OT standpoint, because I mentioned before that IoT and OT devices typically is the first entry point for lateral movement onto a network and other systems and services. So clearly having the right software on those devices and making sure they're patched and updated and valid is a fundamental requirement. So these devices we talk about, they're not just dumb sensors half the time. They are things like diesel engines, industrial equipment, pipelines. We know what happens to those types of environments. Factory lines, secure factory lines. God forbid if someone manages to get on a factory line and takes the factory line down for more than a few minutes, becomes an absolute nightmare. It costs a lot of money. Vehicles, you get the idea, and medical equipment and so forth. And actually, this is driving, we see this need for what we say is continuous assurance to ensure safety, prevent injury for these connected medical devices or industrial equipment, protect the privacy and IP, and maintain identity, data authenticity, prevent disruption to services and secure the products. But all this requires automation and to meet the scale challenge for all these types of different devices. And that continuous assurance really then starts to include things like the SBoM, because today security provisioning, you can't consider it as a one-time event. Security teams need this ongoing validation, integrity verification of devices, and SBoM's a big part of that now. So being able to proactively approach trustworthy for devices, including their software, what's running on those devices through the entire lifetime. And so this is where we've built this thing out called this framework for continuous device assurance. So being able to attest devices, prove identity, prove spoofing, prevent cloning, being able to check the context of the device. What's the device doing at every given moment in time? Is the software running on the device valid against what's been published? For example, the SBoM. Being able to then enforce policy controls about what the device can and can't do, and authorized action, unauthorized actions. And then having a third-party integration to be able to perhaps update the device and have an integration to campaign managers, or being able to send an alert to something like a SIEM. But this continuous assurance type of model then allows you to build a much better system and reduce the risk in those OT and IoT type environments. Anyway, that's a little bit about the use cases and some of the value which these SBoMs can help bring, specifically around IoT. And I guess if you want to reach out to me and talk some more about this, I'd be happy to do that. My email address is on here, or if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, that's fine as well. Happy to discuss some more. And I think we're going to go back and do some Q&A. Thanks very much.
Indeed, Rob. Thank you very much. The Q&A is going to be along in just a few moments. So if anybody who wishes to ask a question or offer up a comment or critique, whatever's on your mind at the moment, if you just wiggle your mouse, and at the bottom of the screen you should see the option for the chat facility. If you put your question or feedback or whatever it is into the chat facility, then I'll come to everybody in turn. So next month's webinar takes place on the 30th of March at the same time. The title is going to be IoT Security for Facilities Professionals in the Smart Built Environment. So in this webinar, we discuss new guidance from the IoTSF on that very subject. So the IoTSF formed a smart building working group in 2017 to look at the issue of risk to buildings from cyber attacks. The topic has become more important over the years, and leaders from IWFM joined us to help write relevant and important guidance for facilities professionals and key stakeholders that they need to work with to manage the risk effectively. In larger organizations, this will of course include cyber and physical security teams and be part of general enterprise risk management strategy. But for many SMEs, there will be fewer experts to help, and this guidance indicates what needs to be done. It takes the view that by identifying the risk and requirements, that the organization will be more resilient. I'm pleased to confirm that we'll have Dave Cook. He is the chair of the IoTSF SBE group and chair of the Risk and Business Continuity Special Interest Group, IWFM. We'll also have Jason Shaw of ACOM, who has been the lead contributor to the guidance as well. They both represent an experienced team of the guide's authors. What could be more important than securing our buildings against cyber attacks if our systems and the technology falls down? That's essentially the premise of the topic that we'll be covering in next month's webinar. So we're keen to hear from you as we develop this important new work in 2023. So we'll come to the Q&A section in just a second. Before that, I just want to shoehorn in a couple of more things. IoTSecurityFoundation.org/chapters. Please go and have a look at that section on the website. We've got ambitions to be truly global, and we've got chapters, very exciting news about chapters in the pipeline. We've got one which I'll say is in Asia. I'll say that another one is in the pipeline for North America, hopefully one in Australasia as well. So again, IoTSecurityFoundation.org/chapters. You'll find my details on there if you've got any questions about chapters. Last month's webinar, by the way, is available to IoTSF members only. If you're on Basecamp, the link is in the plenary. If you attended last month's webinar, then you should have an email with a link to the footage. If you're an IoTSF member and you're having trouble getting access to the footage, do email me. It's chris.benison@IoTSecurityFoundation.org. Last month's webinar, if you haven't heard about it, that was about the PSTI Act here in the UK, and it was also about vulnerability disclosure. So moving on now to the fun part of the webinar, arguably the best part of the webinar. It is the Q&A section, and I'll get things going. I'd like to ask the first question to Dr. Allan Friedman. Aren't you worried about an SBoM being used by hackers, and will it give them a roadmap to attack our systems, Allan?
Well, that was always nice to be the first person to try to speak on mute. Mary asked a very similar question in the chat, so thank you. This is one of the more common approaches, which is saying, hey, can bad guys use this? And of course, one, we want to acknowledge clever bad guys are good at using everything, but it's 2023, so we don't just talk about bad guys, we threat model. So if we're concerned about an advanced adversary that wants to target a particular system or particular product, they can find out what's in an SBoM today, what's in a product today, in a pretty great amount of detail. So There are open source source composition analysis tools. There's a debugger that's used for reverse engineering malware called GIDRA that the National Security Agency gave away because they knew that we're all better off if we know what's in things. So anyone who wants to know what's in a device or product can find out. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got automated attacks, right? These are self-propagating malware that's looking for a toehold to sort of launch ransomware against your critical network. And they don't care about the SBoM. They're just using automated tools that are looking for any vulnerability that they have in their portfolio. So they don't need the roadmap of how to attack your network. But you know who does need the roadmap is the defender, right? People need to figure out what's on their network, especially if it's an OT network, so they can make sure that if there is a risk that we know is being, for example, exploited, CISA maintains the KEV list, the known exploited vulnerability list, as a way of prioritizing things. So an SBoM can help you figure out quickly and easily, do I have anything from that list on my network? Let me patch it, but patching is not always possible. So let me segment my network, let me tune my intrusion detection system, let me take any other action that I may want to have some defensive approaches.
Thank you very much, Alan. Ali's got a question. Ali, do you want to ask it yourself? If you just unmute yourself, Ali. Or I could ask it. Everybody on the Q&A panel, why is SBoM important to security?
We've failed in our job, haven't we?
It seems like it.
I mean, this is what you mentioned, Alan, about I can't remember your acronym, but the silver bullet. Like it does become shorthand for managing supply chain security risks, but as Allan said right at the beginning, it's not the SBoM that actually helps you improve your security posture. It's what you do with it, and that's things. It's the awareness of imported vulnerabilities, being able to become aware quickly so you can respond to it quickly and deal with them. It's knowing who your suppliers are, so you can go through that list of ingredients on the Twinkies and see, like, are there any suppliers in there that maybe aren't good for you, and then you can try to do something about that. And it's the license compliance part of the open source software license compliance. If you have a policy that you are going to comply with open source software licenses, you really need to know, like, what open source software do you have and what are its licenses, so that you can be sure that you're, and importantly, demonstrate that you're complying with it. So if you've got those programs going, then trying to do any of those things without a list of the software components is going to be a real headache. I mean, you'll get some of the way probably, but maybe 10%. If you're lucky. There's the SBoM just magnifies the effectiveness of those programs. So that's what it really does. It's a tool which makes the rest of your work that much easier as a cybersecurity professional.
Question. Sorry, Miles, go on.
I'm going to give a great answer. One of the shorthands that we use is, right, it's a data layer, and data by itself isn't magical for security. You need to go from data to intelligence, and then from intelligence to action. And what I really like about it is there are new ways of leveraging this data based on different people's risks, right? Not every organization has the same risk characteristics. So I'll give a couple of examples. One of them is, hey, are there things that maybe aren't security risks today, but they're no longer supported? So is my device built on a real-time operating system that the manufacturer is not going to patch? They've just said this is end of life or end of support. Well, that's something I need to know about, because then I will say, I'm going to phase this out, or I need to do other defensive things, right? So there you can go from that data SBoM to the intelligence, mapping the SBoM to sources of data that I care about, and then action. right? Do I care about this now? Is this a put it on my 3-year roadmap? What do I need to do? And another interesting example is as we spend more and more time thinking about open source software security, and we touched on this in the discussion. And again, there are different risks. You know, am I worried about certain companies of interest putting a backdoor in a piece of open source? Or am I just worried about a lack of sustainability? So for example, there are a number of open source projects where there's no one actively maintaining it. And that means that there's a decent chance that someone could come in and try to put some malware in that library. And so again, the SBoM itself won't tell you that that's happened, but you cannot really move forward with that risk without it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Did you want to come in on this one as well?
Yeah, well, I was just going to echo what Amyas was saying, and Allan as well, is around the visibility standpoint, right? It's one thing it gives is just a visibility about what's going on in the products, what software is in those products for the guys that are running the services and they're using them. Like, for example, the first thing a CISO would do when they come into a new job is want to understand what devices there have on their network. They might do a scan, say, right, what are all the devices? Next thing I would say is, well, what software is on those devices and what vulnerabilities do I have against them, so I can provide some context around that, which is the visibility piece, right? It's helping to deliver that.
Got a great comment from Michael Richardson. I think that if you're going to talk about the battlefield, you can ask the question, is it easier to find the enemy installations with a map? Of course. Is it easier to find them during the day? Yes. But is it easier to see the attackers during the day? Yes. But the attackers have night vision glasses with infrared vision. The defenders don't. So having a map and daylight helps the defenders much more than the attackers. Gentlemen, would you like to respond to that one?
As always, Michael has good analogies.
Let's see, who else? This question's from Roman. Roman, if you want to unmute, you can ask this question yourself, or I'm happy to ask it on your behalf. Roman, I'll ask it on your behalf. How to get the developers on board with SBoM? From a security expert, it's a no-brainer, while the developers are always busy. And how to get them on board with security?
That's a good question. And I think it's partly to do with having the right tools in place, having software bill of materials as part of the process when you're generating software, and having the standardized approach to generate them, like the Cyclone DX and SPDX. So and just take the pain out of it, right? So you just hit a button and generate the SBoMs. That's utopia, right?
And it's not that we're not that far from it, right?
Yeah.
There are if your organization has the words CI in it someplace, then you're ahead of the game. There are tools that will just automatically put this out, because again, you cannot compile software without knowing what the pieces that are going into the software is. And I'll add one more thing. This is one of those issues that is rare in security, which actually puts an advantage in the hands of smaller and newer organizations, right? A lot of security regs, the benefit goes to the mega company that can cover the cost of compliance. Whereas those large organizations are having to bring in binary analysis tools and sort of navigate all of those different product families they have. Whereas if you're a newer organization with a newer, fresher software model, then this really is just a couple of plugins. So for example, those of you who work in containers, there's a command in Docker called SBoM. You know what it does? It gives you an SBoM. And so, and again, not everything is quite so turnkey, but this is one of those areas that if we do have the ability to ease the burden on developers by just making this a standard part of our testing, our DevSecOps process, et cetera.
Around 5 more minutes to go. Sorry, Miles, did you want to come in on that quickly?
I just wanted to chip in about the quality aspect of it. I mean, there's nothing that development teams and operations teams hate more than drama, and having to deal with a Christmas Day Log4j is absolutely bottom of the list of the things they want to be doing. I think actually a good way to frame it is this is the excuse they've been looking for to put the time that they've always wanted into the quality aspect of their craft, because often that gets squeezed by product deadlines and stuff. And really this implementing the SSDF or any other secure software development lifecycle and vulnerability management, it's all about quality. It takes drama out of the development team's lives, and I think they'll actually appreciate that. It's more work up front, but they can sleep well at night.
Thanks, Amyas. Somebody, I think it was it Michael, just had his hand up. Michael asked or made a comment on your behalf a few moments ago, but Michael, did you want to unmute and come in?
Hi, yeah. So I often find that there's some kind of belief that there's some bigger problem that SBoMs are more of an open source. And Allan said something that people are concerned about, oh, there's some project's going to fail and someone's going to take it over. And as an open source developer and as someone who has consulted to many companies that do things without open source, I have the complete opposite view. Open source is transparent as to what it's using. Nobody comes in and does a pull request. Like, people somehow believe that open source out there in the non-technical world, that because it's open that we accept pull requests from anybody. And it's exactly the opposite, right? I mean, they're scrutinized far more than a pull request in a closed company is, where, you know, often they're simply closed every morning because no one has time to review them anymore. So actually, the biggest threat, as far as I can see, in most legacy organizations, as Allan suggested, is that there is some binary that is part of their build process that no one has a clue where it comes from, that it was, you know, installed not by the guy that you laid off last week, but the guy that you laid off 3 years ago. And they just were cargo culting it. They don't even know what it did. So even if you clone them up, they still don't have a clue what it is, right? And so that's actually where you get into the, oh my goodness, we need binary analysis tools to figure out what's going on here. And I actually think that the bigger threat, the bigger for supply chain attacks, is in these things that are completely undocumented, where no one has any idea what's going on. And that's honestly where we need, and where consumers need the software bill of materials, because, you know, who knew there was tallow in your Microsoft Word, right? I mean, you just had no idea, and you would never have found it if you didn't read the ingredients. So I find that some of the concern about, you know, open source and software bill of materials, it's just totally wrong founded. And I don't know if that's the result of FUD that's going on or what, but you know, I keep hearing it and I really don't understand it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Strictly one more question, and gentlemen, I'll ask in the politest possible way if you can keep your response to this as succinct as you can. What's the state of tooling? How far away are we from having a CVE event causing a rebuild and release of a product without human intervention?
I mean,
I'm trying to think. Oh, go on, Allan.
I mean,
I'd rather you took that one.
so you can script today for GitHub Dependabot to automatically redo your dependencies, right? This is something that can exist today. The challenge is there is so much nuance in the differences between what else that might break. And that's this grand vision of automated software building has some potential, but software is complex, right? This dependency has a loop back here, which in turn goes over here, which has a framework that is somewhere in the middle of 2.5 and 3.0, et cetera, et cetera. Where we are for tooling today, though, is I think we're now much better than we were a couple of years ago for prioritizing vulnerabilities, right? To be able to say, having automated tooling to say, you've got 27 overnight dependencies that need to be updated, but these are we're getting better at detecting what will be the problematic ones, and we're getting better at the ones that say, you know what, you can probably safely ignore this for the time being. So that's where we are. And from a tooling perspective, broader for SBoM generation isn't a completely solved problem, but it's mature. We've got tools that fit into the build process. We've got binary analysis tools that all have different specialties. Where we're starting to head is taking the SBoMs and again, turning that into intelligence. So how do I map it to databases that I care about that we were talking about earlier? There are tools like Gripe, like Dependency Track, that are starting in that direction. There's an open source project called Daggerboard. And then where we don't have tooling today, where I think there's huge opportunity, is the data management piece, right? How do I integrate this efficiently if you're a manufacturer in your product security team? And there are products out there that are starting to meet that need. And if it's on your network, well, there are products out there and just sort of help manage it. But the plumbing part is one of those pieces that I think some folks are going to be able to make some money on.
Yeah, just to add on to that as well, and I think there'll always be some environments where you don't want a fully automated system, like for example, stuff that's really safety critical, or stuff that's really, it's going to cause harm to people, and there'll always then be a requirement for some oversight from a human to be able to, hey, right, let's just not fully automate this because I might break a million devices or I might cause some harm to somebody. So I think that's something to take into account as well.
Ash, you've got the final word.
Yeah, just thanks very much everyone for listening. This has been it's been a real privilege to talk to you and to share the panel with my illustrious colleagues. I guess I'll just wrap up with one final plug for the paper. We're proud of it. It's had lots of input from around the community. Please go and check it out if you are a software vendor in the IoT supply chain, or a device vendor, or a user, and you should find something useful in there to help protect yourself from supply chain risks.
So that very paper, as we mentioned previously, is available at IoTSecurityFoundation.org. That brings us, unfortunately, to the end of today's webinar. My thanks to my colleagues. This is very much a team effort: Jenny, Grant, Angela, and Lauren. My particular thanks to Allan Friedman for joining us from Washington, DC. I think it's quite early on in the morning over there, is it not, Allan?
It's now well into the mid-morning.
Right, okay. And thank you very much from England, Amyas and Rob. For myself in Bonnie, Scotland, thank you very much for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, the next webinar from us here at IoTSF will be entitled IoT Security for Facilities Professionals in the Smart Built Environment. Today's webinar, if you're an IoTSF member, has been recorded, so you'll have access to the footage in due course. But in the meantime, thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Again, my sincere thanks to all of our speakers, Allan, Amyas, and Rob today. That's everything from us. My name's Chris for IoTSF. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.